Now, that does raise a subtle and quite significant point in the interview that I think is worth mentioning, and it's relevant to William and Catherine, George, Charlotte and Louis. Hi, and thank you so much for joining me for this rather unexpected episode. Well, the verdict that we expected is in. Harry will maintain his security as it is. He must give 28 days notice if he intends to visit the UK, and security will be provided based on perceived risk. He didn't regain his IPP status, and many believe that that was the true end goal, either by himself or those in his immediate orbit. Now, the late Queen Elizabeth II made it crystal clear you're either in or you're out. There's no half measures. And Harry and Meghan made the mistake, I believe, of underestimating the significance of that statement. I think they thought she meant unveiling plaques, appearing on the balcony, or having dedicated staff to sort of fulfill their every whim. But she was in fact meaning it literally. She was being very honest, and she wanted her grandson to heed her words, ponder them, and really realise the consequences of their actions. And she gave them over a year to do just that. But she wasn't talking about duties. She was talking about being an insider or an outsider of a very powerful institution that was bigger than him, bigger than them, and in many ways, bigger than her. Now, I don't think that this was genteel advice delivered by a doting grandmother. It was stark reality, delivered by a battle-hardened monarch, the head of a powerful and steely institution. Look, in my mind, it's always been more Sopranos than The Crown. And I think that that's fair enough. I think it would have to be in order to survive. When Harry was firmly in, and I'm not just talking about firmly within the family, I'm talking about considered an asset to the institution. And he was considered a real asset to the institution prior to meeting Meghan. He enjoyed the protection that afforded him. And I'm not talking about armed security. I'm talking about protection from consequences, protection for being held accountable for his actions. And by his own account in his memoir Spare, there was years of drug taking, years of irresponsible behaviour, poor decisions, petulant displays. And his life was eased, and he was gained entry to training and opportunities that he hadn't really earned, but rather his pathway was smoothed. I think he underestimated that when you're in, you're considered an asset. And when you're out, when you leave, you cease to be one. You become a wild card, a threat to the institution due to the knowledge that you hold and also by the company you keep. Now, that sounds like hyperbole. I can just hear you all now. Oh, Shauna, that sounds like such a far-fetched conspiracy theory. But it isn't at all. It's the real world. And I can give you a real-world example. It happens all the time. You would have heard of or seen people being escorted from the premises of major companies. Their laptops are locked. All access to company data is removed. It's denied. They're given a strict time frame to return all company property, and permission to ever enter the premises again is removed. That's a real-world example. You're either in or you're out. Now, this harsh exclusion can be mitigated by moving on with dignity, keeping your mouth shut, by creating a new life that is truly independent of your past, that doesn't involve, reference, besmirch, or betray the institution or the company you left. And that is the only viable or realistic option available to Harry and Meghan. And that would have ensured them still to have access to the family that Harry claims he misses. But they blew it, didn't they? Harry's fatal mistake was that he was convinced that he was bigger than the whole machine. And we all know that Meghan definitely thought she was bigger than the whole machine. They never accepted the reality that they were just minor cogs in a powerful engine that was constantly being overhauled to make it more efficient. And it could be argued that the then Prince Charles, his father, experienced that same level of delusion for a period of time. He sort of displayed the same lack of discipline for a large portion of his life. And he too betrayed his family with interviews and books and poor decisions and, quite frankly, questionable behaviour. But the difference is he stayed. He stayed within the institution. He grew into his responsibilities and as such has remained an asset, and as such is still afforded that protection. And he's matured into being sovereign. And many believe in him and many admire him. And really there was a sigh of relief from royalists all throughout the world that he actually appears to be doing a very, very good job. Now, I'm going to be sharing some stories from these books in programs to come in my Unanswered Questions podcast. The Prince of Wales, a biography by Jonathan Dimbleby, which we all know that then Prince Charles had major input in, and the rather not as flattering portrait done by Tom Bower in The Rebel Prince, and later the title of that was updated to The Rebel King to actually reflect King Charles III's new status. But the stories are incredibly fascinating, and I think it's going to be really intriguing to look back at some of those mysteries. Now back to Hapless Has. So what you've heard in Prince Harry's recent BBC California interview was a howl of indignation, a realisation of what being truly out means. And the reaction to that was universally unsympathetic by, I'd say, pretty much everybody, including myself. So many years we've tried to sort of shake sense into him, to wake him up. And look, let's face it, he was even thrown into a dog bowl, and even that didn't work. The headlines concern themselves with this recent interview, with his petty, petulant, sulky take. The fact that he blamed everyone except his own behaviour and his wife's behaviour. There was no acceptance of any personal responsibility, no acknowledgement of the part they played in this saga that pretty much was of their own making. He is indeed still in the trenches with Meghan, convinced that it's all everybody else's fault, the press, his father, his brother, and his evil stepmother. And as I was watching him in this interview, it dawned on me something I think is worth mentioning. I truly believe he doesn't trust them. I think he truly believes that there are forces within the institution that wouldn't care if he came to harm. I think he believes he is now expendable, a problem eradicated. That is his level of paranoia. He believes his security needs were assessed from high to low overnight because he no longer mattered to the institution, not because he was no longer a working member of the royal family and UK taxpayers shouldn't have to fund him to that extent anymore. No, he believes he doesn't matter. He believes he no longer has any worth to anybody. And he expected his family, or hoped that his family, would intervene at that point. Now, the late Queen reportedly did. It's alleged that she made it very clear that she wanted her grandson's security to continue as it was prior to their exit being made permanent. Now, there's a misconception that these decisions are made and can be reversed via the legal process, and that isn't true, and Harry found that out $1.5 million later. Ravik does indeed operate outside any legal or enforceable framework. Now, that is understandable and I would argue essential, because it must be able to make hard decisions, independent decisions, without fear or favour. Now, it's said that prominent members of the royal household do sit on the Ravik board, and as such, they represent the royal household's interests. Now, for security reasons, we aren't told a lot of detail, though it is accepted that the Sovereign's private secretary does sit on the Ravik board, and actually Harry himself outed Sir Clive Alderton as actually being on the Ravik board. Now, Ravik listens and acts on the advice of the Risk Assessment Board, which Harry mentioned several times in the half-hour interview, which is an independent entity. And risk assessments are made on members of the royal family and other prominent public figures, usually yearly. Harry makes the allegation that he has not been assessed by this independent risk assessment board for 5 years, since 2020. Now, I doubt that's true because he's had numerous trips to the UK within those last 5 years, and his perceived risk would have been evaluated, if not every time, quite a few times. However, he did make a rather interesting point, that his interest as a member of the royal family was being represented on the RAVIC board by sitting members that represent the royal household. And he didn't trust those people. He didn't want to be represented by them at all. And I can understand that because he thinks they actually wish him harm. So he wasn't asking his father to intervene. He was asking that the royal household no longer represent him as a member of the royal family on the RAVIC board. Now, I think that's why some of the MSM coverage is flawed, because it distorts his main complaint. Now, that does not make his complaint more valid, but it's always important to present the facts, isn't it? I think his main mistake, in my humble opinion, was to pursue this through the courts, His Majesty's justice system, because it was at considerable cost to the UK taxpayer. It placed his father in an untenable position, and it's not the way to win back favour, Has. So I question the advice he's received, legal and personal, and the sources of influence that have been governing him since he left. Now, that doesn't result in my sympathy, as let's face it, he's a grown-up now. He's over 40. He has the ability to seek independent advice or knowledge at any point, like the rest of us have to do. But once outside, you are vulnerable, and I don't think you can underestimate that. You're vulnerable to being used by those that seek to harm the royal family. Now, he also delivered misinformation in the interview. He claimed that people that choose to serve their country, and an example of this would be an MP, receive security if they serve their country for at least 4 years, and that it's automatic and that it's for life. That isn't true. As in Harry's case, individual assessments are made, and security is assigned according to risk and on a case-by-case basis, which of course Harry still receives. Now, that does raise a subtle and quite significant point in the interview that I think is worth mentioning, and it's relevant to William and Catherine, George, Charlotte and Louis, and their possible future families. If a member of the Wales family decides to leave and wants a life, really wants a life outside the institution, I think it's valid to assume that they would be a serious target, purely because they're closely related to the reigning sovereign. And as such, I think they need a form of continued protection. Okay, now I think that this should be formalised. I think it should be decided and clearly outlined, clear guidelines made, irrespective of the person involved, irrespective of whether we like them or not, whether we perceive them as a traitor or not, whether we think they're trying to harm the royal family or not. I think there needs to be clear guidelines. I think it needs to be formalised. And do you know why I think that? Because I think Harry had one valid point, that security concerns could hold someone inside the institution even if they didn't want to live their life like that. And let's face it, they're within that institution purely by an accident of birth. And security concerns could hold them within that institution. So I think that's one aspect of Harry's argument that could be true. I hate to say it, but I think his risk assessment was adjusted to him no longer being a working member of the royal family. And, you know, people point out that other non-working members of the royal family have had their security pulled. I mean, Prince Andrew is a classic example. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, no longer receive security. Princess Anne and Edward only receive security in the performance of their official duties, and that too could be argued that that is unfair. Harry said that his family threw their duty of care out the window. He raised the question that if anything should happen to his father's grandchildren, where does the responsibility lie? Now, Many have said today on social media that that was a veiled threat against William's children. And I think taken out of context as a clip, it could be perceived that way. But when you watch the whole interview, you can see that he was very, very clear. He was discussing his own family only. Plus, William's family has full security, the very security that Harry is desperate for. So I think it's not a veiled threat. I think it was a clear emotional manipulation, obviously aimed squarely at his father. And I think it's well-practiced tactic for Has. So the harsh reality is that the duty of care and the full responsibility for his family transferred to him. Probably for the first time in his life, he was completely responsible for a major decision he made. He was completely responsible for the severe consequences of that decision. And when he made the decision to leave, and not only leave, but attack the very institution and the very country he was asking protection from, that's on him. That was on him, that was on Meghan. And the duty of care and responsibility for them and their children is firmly in their court. The ball is in their court. So you are out, Harry, Meghan. So give you 28 days notice and accept what you get, because you have no other choice. And I would avoid writing further nasty little memoirs or telling tales out of school or being a constant source of irritation, because that just makes you more of a liability. And that is the harsh reality that your Commander-in-Chief, your late grandmother, tried to warn you about. The damage is indeed done. And I want to finish off with a quote from William. "I've put my arm around my brother all our lives, and I can't do that anymore because we're separate entities." And I would argue, not only separate entities, he's in and you're out, Harry. He's an insider, you're an outsider. And while you're at it, do something about your sniff, honey. I know it makes IPP status even more vital, but that isn't really the world's responsibility. Okay, leave your comments down below. I'd be very interested to read your take, and I will be reading them all, and I will be back with you very soon. Bye.